Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of our Experts Insights webinar series. I'm your host, Avery Zimmerman, and today's session is focused on getting the most out of data visualizations in pharma and biotech, presented by MMS. As an innovative data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. Here to present today is Dr. Eric Harvey, Senior Director of Biostatistics and Data Science, and Chris Hurley, Director of Data Science and Fuse America's Director. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for this session and we'll send out a recording following the webinar. If you have questions, please ask them at any time in the Q&A icon at the top right of your screen. We'll answer them at the conclusion of today's session. And with that, I'll turn it over to the presenters.
Thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Getting the Most Out of Data Visualizations in Pharma and Biotech. I am Eric Harvey, and I have the pleasure of co-presenting this webinar today.
And I'm Chris Hurley, a Director of Data Science at MMS and Fuse America's Director, and I'm also happy to be here today.
So this is a continuation of an Expert Insights webinar from 2020, and if you are interested, please check it out on the MMS website. And the examples you see today will be from pharma and biotech, but the standards we are discussing can be applied in most any industry. So I will go over our agenda today. We'll have an introduction and make sure we are all speaking the same language with regards to definitions. I'll go over 6 principles of graphical integrity. We'll talk briefly about the development process for interactive dashboards and how that differs from our normal static visualizations. We'll talk about building effective data visualizations, what you need to be thinking about when you're doing that, and go over some of the best practices regarding visualizations. And at the end, we'll put it all together with a demo using our data visualization system. So data visualization goes back actually over 200 years, well before we had computers. William Playfair, who was a Scottish engineer, was credited with the development of bar charts and pie charts, of course, all done by hand at that point. Not too long after that, we had our first widely recognized healthcare application of data visualizations. And you may remember this name from history. Florence Nightingale, during the Crimean War, actually created a special rose diagram to help visualize poor sanitation conditions and document malnutrition among the soldiers. And how they handled sanitation in the military actually changed because of the graphs and the data that she was able to display convincingly. So in definitions, the industry is really starting to standardize on definitions, but you will still hear people using terms differently across different industries. So a few definitions here. Really, what we mean by data analytics is summarizing data to obtain insights not visible in raw data. So as humans, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, we're not very good at visualizing without help. Data visualization is just a graphical representation of data. And when we say dashboard, what we're really talking about is a collection of data visualizations. And these can contain analytics and often do. When we talk about data filters, you may also hear us refer to them as data slicers. These allow you to target the visualization on a desired subset of data. You may have drop-down menus to select different filters, different criteria to subset the data on. So you may be asking yourself, why do we need to visualize? And the answer is that really humans are not great at seeing patterns. We naturally look for patterns, but we tend to see patterns that may or may not be meaningful. And data visualization is a more formal representation of these data and supports analysis goals. If you think about looking at a giant Excel spreadsheet and what we call raw data, it's very difficult to make sense of that without having it summarized in some form or fashion, such as a data visualization. And these three bullets at the bottom of this slide, I'll call the three guiding principles really of the broad topics you need to think about when creating data visualization. Knowing your audience, this is always true of any presentation. Don't use misleading data displays. So not to say that we would intentionally mislead someone, but it may be a good idea to run your data display by others who can give you some valuable feedback. We call that user acceptance testing, or a pilot group as well. Understand your data and its veracity. Make sure that your data is correct, otherwise you can have the best visualizations in the world and have them not be meaningful. So these books here are meant to be humorous, but they really call attention to what can be a major issue with data displays. And this happens probably more often than you would think, that people can generate misleading data displays. So actually, this made me think back. The first assignment in one of my grad school classes in clinical research was to go find 3 articles that had significant data misrepresentations in graphics or tables. And at the time, I remember thinking the professor was crazy, but I have to say it was easier than I thought. There are confusing data displays everywhere. And some of the major issues I see time and time again are related to scale issues. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I think that's one of the major misrepresentations potentially of data. Or confusing correlation with causation, right? Just because things tend to trend together doesn't mean that one necessarily causes the other. And I'll admit, I have given this same assignment to go out and look for data misrepresentations in courses that I've taught. And this is one strong reason that we peer review our scientific articles, to make sure that we catch these things. And really the point of all of this is to develop critical thinking skills around data and how to best communicate your results. And a strong caveat here as well, just because data presentations may be misleading or incorrect, intent cannot be assumed. It may be done purposely sometimes, but more often than not, we just don't think through our visualizations quite well enough. So now I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about the 6 principles of graphical integrity. So these principles were documented by Edward Tufte, who is a statistician. Several of you may recognize his name. I have actually heard him speak, but he is probably the most authoritative statistician on the graphical presentation of data. And I'll go through these 6 principles quickly, but I do recommend his book documented at the bottom here if you want to do some further reading. So the first principle is really around how we present the scale of numbers. And if you look at the graph on the right, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so they say. But 2013 looks roughly 3 times as high as 2011, right? And this is a visual scale effect here. The bar on the right is only actually 1.16 times bigger than the bar on the left. But see how quickly you can begin to jump to conclusions. And it all has to do with where the scale starts on this graph. And really, we should start, most frequently, our scale should start off at 0. So principle 2 is really about labeling your data. Of course, when we're doing a data display, we want to be clear as to what we are actually trying to communicate, what the data represent. So labeling axes and events you want the reader to focus on. Most of us are familiar with the stock market data represented in the graph below, but what's not clear is necessarily the time frame, right? We can graph stock performance across daily, monthly, yearly, etc. These graphs are good if you're looking at the performance within one stock, but they need to have the same baseline and the labeling align in order to compare stocks across the same periods and make sure that we're doing that accurately. So principle 3 is really about keeping it simple. So you see the graph on the right is quite complex, and the question is, do we need it to be complex, right? Are the data overrepresented here and that? And sometimes you can minimize your message by maximizing the complexity of the display, and we don't want that to happen. So definitely the example on the right, it's not really clear or useful, I would argue, why the graph is divided into quadrants. So again, think about that. You may be able to use a much more simple display here to convey the same data. So principle 4 is really about time series data. So the key here is to think about your baselines, particularly if your definitions or values might change over time. In this example, across decades, we have inflation, and $1 in 1970, for example, may not be worth the same amount, will not be worth the same amount as $1 today, right? So you may need to make adjustments to your baseline and do what they call normalize the data in order to compare across long time frames. So principle 5 here, these graphs can show kind of how three-dimensional graphs may be difficult to read or interpret. So really humans deal best when they're dealing with 2 dimensions, right? The x-axis, the y-axis that we all learned. So I would suggest that you think carefully before using a 3-dimensional graph. There are definitely applications where these graphs are preferable, but in these 2 examples here, I think it just adds to the confusion of the data when maybe a 2-dimensional line chart would work just as well or better. So principle 6 is really about taking data in context. We often see this again in time series data when comparing different periods. For example, the graphs at the bottom, the one on the left looks like it's strictly decreasing, right? And these represent traffic deaths in Connecticut. So it may be strictly decreasing in that narrow 1-year period. But if you look at the broader pattern on the right, you can see that we just happened to zoom in on a time period where it was decreasing. And actually, though it bounces around some, it was overall increasing until a fall off on the right side of the graph. So just beware of scale again, and also the baseline. So this data ink ratio concept was fairly new to me. So it is defined as the total data ink, or we don't use ink here, the total pixels used to print the graphic is a proportion of the pixels or ink devoted to basically the display of meaningful information. And this really is illustrated well in these 2 graphs on the right. The top graph, you have some ink or pixels involved in the background and some of the cross-hatching. The bottom is much simpler. So the data to ink ratio is much higher for the bottom plot, and it allows you to jump much quicker to see what the data might be telling us. Now, I would argue that if I were doing these graphs, you might want to come up with something in between the 2 of these. But again, these are just examples. So there are really 5 laws that the professor came up with regards to data ink ratio. So really just showing the data that you want to show, maximizing this data ink ratio if possible. And then if you have a lot of annotations on your graph that are non-meaningful, you may want to think about erasing or removing them, and revise and edit as we learn, right? Take feedback seriously from your users and the consumers of these data, and they are the ones that are our audience and ultimately our customers. All right, so I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Chris Hurley now for the development process for interactive dashboards.
All right, thanks a lot, Eric. Can you go to the next slide, please? So Eric mentioned Florence Nightingale and the Crimea War. You can think of Lloyd Alfred Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, where a mistaken communication, sent 600 off into eternity. So it's an interesting poem, but the idea that the communication that is conveyed needs to be accurate and prompt. So when you're talking about dashboards, you want to make sure everything is correct and that the dashboards are conveying the right information. So, and how do you do that? Well, we have a development process for these dashboards. We first have a discovery session to understand from your stakeholders what's important to them, what's the business reason for the dashboards, what are you trying to convey. Once we've got that set up, the next thing that you really want to do is you want to spec these out, but because it's dashboards and you're trying to build a solution that makes sense, it's sometimes better to start with a prototype. So you create a prototype, you develop some specifications based on the accepted prototype after your stakeholders have had a chance to look at it. Then you go ahead and you start your planning and intended use of your dashboards. From there, you'll obtain your data, your extract, transform, and load. Maybe it's an API into some EDC system or some other form of data from somewhere else. You're going to analyze the data per your specifications. So make sure that everything is spec'd out nicely, because you're going to want to take those specifications later and develop testing specifications from those. So specifications are important. Once they're spec'd out, you can create the visualizations based on the analysis data. So the data that you have extracted, you've transformed it into a form and a shape that you can analyze. And then from there, you develop your visualizations. Then you can perform your user acceptance testing on them. So it's a process that's repeatable. You'll see that you can go through a number of iterations. Some of the things, as your stakeholders are, looking at these dashboards, using these dashboards, they're wanting more and more. All of a sudden, they're seeing things that they haven't seen before, because visualizations really bring those instant insights, and they want more. So you need to be able to control that and maintain and manage those change requests and those updates. So, and as you have many different changes after a dashboard goes to production, you want to make sure you keep good documentation so you know exactly what those dashboards were at the state of the time that they were released, and any subsequent releases. Okay, Eric, next slide, please. So let's talk about building effective visualizations. Next slide. You really want to get those instant insights, and you want to make sure that the insights that you're getting aren't misleading, right? But the ability to see the trends and signals from your data quickly, especially when there's time constraints, the value is immeasurable. You really need to be able to see these dashboards in real time, and being able to connect to databases such as electronic data capture gives you those instant and interactive views of the data. Now, some of this data, it can be analyzed through standard tools, like for instance, we have a data science application. We use Power BI. Basically, it's an Azure-based platform. When Power BI doesn't have enough visualizations for us, we can go into the R packages or the Python packages. There's thousands and thousands of ways to visualize your data, and thousands of packages available. So with good specifications, a good understanding of what your sponsors need, your stakeholders need, you can develop the right package and the right dashboards for them. So you're going to create these interactive views. Again, the data is in real time, so depending on the frequency of the data, it can be real time. You want to be able to give your users the ability to filter through the data, and then once they've got that data presentation the way they want it, then download that data where they can share with their colleagues. And I'll show you some of that as we go through a demo in a little while. So you refresh your data at regular intervals. You can have standard designs, flexible designs. We have a set of standard dashboards that we can apply to the clinical study data. We also have flexible and more analytical dashboards that we apply to some efficacy data, since that may change from study to study. And again, there are thousands of packages that enable us to match the right visualizations with the right requirements for the dashboard. Okay, Eric, next slide, please. So there are some different use cases for visualizations. On the left side here, you can see some operational insights where we show real-time data visualization from your electronic data capture data, like your IBM clinical database or Oracle database or whatever you're using. We can provide support for data management. You can answer questions from a user perspective without waiting for programming, because you can start filtering through the data and start looking to see where your subjects, where's enrollment, where are the adverse events. You don't have to wait for programmers because the data is right there at your fingertips if it's, frequent data. You can also augment standard tables, listings, and graphs for reporting events like DSMBs. So these monitoring committees want to look at the data every quarter, and you give standard tables, listings, and graphs to them. Those are static, right? Validated. But they may also want to look at data visualizations so that they can start thumbing through the data and filtering and seeing really what are those signals that they're looking for, that they're responsible for, as reviewers of your data. So the interactive, sliceable, and exportable data really facilitates the sharing of these insights across your DSMBs. There's also support for clinical operations like site performance dashboards, where you may look for some queries, query aging, some other things, based on what's happening with the subjects within your trials. So that those are the operational insights that you can look at. The safety and efficacy reporting, we have standard safety measures, standard primary and secondary safety and efficacy endpoints, blinded versus unblinded. Now you have to pay attention when you're creating dashboards and you're putting values into dashboards, like say there's laboratory values. You need to be sure that you're not potentially unblinding your study because you're giving some values that may potentially reveal, which subjects are on drug or not. But the idea that if you do have some blinded dashboards, that they truly are blinded, and the unblinded are truly unblinded. But again, those are the things that your stakeholders can use and look for those things. These are some unblind, these are potentially, revealing results. Let's go look at them and filter through them and see, you can filter who's treated, who's not, and so forth. So there is also the ability for streaming devices and wearables and other patient-reported data that may come in from devices, where we can API right into that information, bring it into a dashboard, and summarize that quickly so that you can understand what's going on with those things. With regards to patient profiles, we can capture instant insights in that if you have adverse events or you have certain efficacy parameters or endpoints happening, you can see in context with those endpoints what's happening in the other data domains. So there are 5, 6, 7, 8 domains that you want to put together so that you can truly understand within the context of the trial what's happening with your patients, and that's a really good way to use data visualizations. Okay, next slide, Eric. Okay, let's talk a little bit about best practices within your visualizations. So dashboard design standards are key. You want a consistent look and feel. You want to keep things simple, and you want them intuitive, and you want them instant, and you want the important things together in one screen, and above all, do not mislead. So here's an example of a dashboard. Of course, this isn't your clinical dashboard, but this is regarding the instant insights. You need to have an idea when you're flying a plane, your heading, your attitude, the pitch, the airspeed, all these things. You aviate, that's the #1 rule of flying. Make sure you're flying the plane. If you go into a turn, make sure you got a coordinated turn. You've got this little turn coordinator on the bottom left. You've got a vertical speed. Are you climbing too quickly? Are you descending too quickly? These things, there's certain times in the flight where you have to understand what's happening instantly. And if by creating a a dashboard and having that consistent dashboard between most small planes. These are very consistent with a number of airplanes, and provide those instant insights you need. You can't be looking at your gauges all the time. You need to be able to understand quickly what's happening with your flight. So in the same way, clinical data, you can get those instant insights as you're piloting your clinical study, right? You need to know quickly, and some of the things that I talked about, enrollment and some other things, some safety and efficacy measures that are happening, you need to know. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to show some of those to you, but in a consistent way. Next slide, Eric. So one of the ways to keep it simple is a rule of 7. Okay, we're human, right? We can't possibly see everything at the same time, right? So 7 plus or minus 2 numbers at the same time is a fairly good rule of thumb. PowerPoint bullets benefit from this rule, but so does do your visualizations. So here we have an example on the right here on passenger car sales over a few years here between 2005 and 2013. Okay, there's a lot of data here. I mean, you're looking at this, it's confusing, right? Because why am I using a 3D graph here when a 2D graph would be much better, because you eliminate all the shadowing and some of the cluttered look and feel to this dashboard. So the suggestion here would be, don't create a 3D dashboard when you can do it in 2 dimensions, and don't put too many years. If you do get any more years than this, I would suggest you do some sort of a line plot or a scatter plot or something where it's easier to see across time points the various levels here. But you start to lose after a while, after a certain number, what is really the meaning here, what's happening here. So understand, what it is you're trying to say. That comes from the stakeholders' requirements, and improve on your dashboards, but everything, above all else, keep them simple. Okay, next slide, Eric. So a top-down flow, with your slicers, and put those insights right in front of the user. So if you look on the left, we have some cards and we show some numbers, and we have a way we can filter to study arm or to analysis sets, right? So you have that, and way over to the right, you have subject IDs, and you can click on a subject ID and filter to that subject ID to see what adverse events are happening. But the instant insights are right in front of you with the system organ classes. What are the most prevalent adverse events? Maybe this is a study where they're looking for a particular, adverse event. This is a way to show simply what's happening with regards to your adverse events, and the ability to slice and filter through this. Next slide. For those dashboards where you might have a number of different domains that you want to try to show, this is a good example. Again, we have the slicers on the left and subject numbers on the right, and then what is it that we're trying to show? Perhaps, where are your sites located, and, some of the demographics of the subject, maybe some of the dispositions. So you have a number of different domains here, fit them to one page, but keep it simple. You have aside from these cards, you have 4 cards on the left with those subject numbers like screen and randomized and so forth, but you have a minimum number of data visualizations. There's 5 of them here, but they're simple enough that you can easily scan through those and get the insights that you're looking for. Next slide, Eric. So now at this point, we're going to put this together, and I'm going to show you by using some of these principles, you can create a nice set of dashboards. So we're going to leave the presentation for a minute here. Now let's give a demo of what's happening with our dashboards and how good design facilitates good dashboards and ease of use for your stakeholders. So this is a standard layout. I just showed you this on the slides, right? We looked at it, right? So you have some cards, you have an ability to filter, So you can filter through any of these. You can click on a subject. You can see, you know, where a subject lies. You know, and the nice thing about these dashboards, everything's interactive. So you can click around and you can get different, you know, different items out of this dashboard. And you can see anytime you filter, the data changes. And so the nice thing about interactive dashboards and about having the data associated with your dashboards is that in this case, we can export the data. We export it as a CSV file, and then somebody can share, you know, the insights they were looking for. Hey, we did this filter. Hey, look at this. You know, look what's happening here in the data. So it's really nice when you can do that, and then share the data with your colleagues. So we want to keep visualizations simple, right? And so, you know, we showed you that that three-dimensional bar chart. You know, two-dimensional bar charts are a lot easier to understand, and then you can see within the bar charts, you know, the natural order of things. How many, in this case, how many subjects are experiencing these things? So one of the principles that you have to think about the users of your dashboards, right? You give them all these great abilities to filter and slice, you know, but you know, there may be some users might have maybe colorblind or have some difficulty understanding between the colors. Like, you know, when you get to blues and grays, you know, I lose some of that ability. What you want to do is be able to put the categories on your bars, right? So so their users can understand, yeah, which color was this, you know, these colors look the same, you know, what's going on here. So it's a nice when you can roll over some of the text over your bars. So that was one of the nice things you should do for your users is, you know, label your bars appropriately and share that information. So again, standard layout. The standard layout almost it looks like an L, right? Or even a horseshoe, right? So these things are always here. The users, they don't have to look for how do I select between one arm or the other or one study or the other, right? They already start getting an expectation of where they're able to filter. Okay. One of the things that is a little pet peeve of mine is using pie charts. You know, when you get to these really thin slices, it's pretty hard to tell, you know, just at a glance, what, you know, is this one bigger than this one, you know, so, and does it matter, you know, so it's always better if you can, you know, keep the pie chart simple with only just a few items in a pie chart, but where you can use bar charts, you know, this here, there aren't that many dispositions, so we used it. Users like it. You know, I like bar charts. It's just a personal preference, but just something to note. It can be difficult to read. Let's go down to another one here. Let's go here. I'll show you about that difference between the bar charts. So you have a stacked bar chart, and you can easily see the difference. 69, 65, 50, 62. These would in a pie chart almost look the same, but it's nice because you can get a nice order when you stack your bar charts. Again, as you roll your mouse over, make sure you're presenting what the categories are here for your users. But here's this L again, right? We've got the data. We even have the data descriptions. So we have data coming from different domains. It's nice to know where the data is coming from. We give them an opportunity to share data and the users the opportunity to understand what they're sharing. Let's go to findings about. This is a very difficult domain for programmers, you know, stats programmers, people that deal with this stuff all the time. You know, it's a CDISC domain. It's data about data. And so it's when you're trying to understand what's going on, I think they try to keep it simple, especially for your users. In this case, we had some symptoms for IDH symptoms and IDH interventions. So we've kind of split the dashboard in two so that you've got the items that are related together with each other. So Yeah, so one of the principles is try to keep your dashboards logical, right? And again, here we have the same filtering. We've got some cards, the data, and so forth. So group your visualizations when you have a number of them on the screen where it's logical to do so, so that your users can understand. Let's look at labs. So with labs, we have the same thing. We've got the filters, we've got the data, we've got also another way to slice. We can look for these clinically important values, and if you notice, the data changes, and you can see these are exceptionally low. We've got a spider plot over here. So when your users are looking at these dashboards, make sure that that all these things, that all this data is relating to your filtering and what's important. So for this particular study, it was important to understand where some of the values were coming in low, because they were looking for a particular condition. Let me state that this is all fake data, so that we're not revealing anybody's information. This is anonymized data for a stats programming exercise, set of exercises for our MMS academies, which is a really thorough way to learn about stats programming, and has great data like this behind it. When we look at scatter plots, this is a nice feature. You can look at your data with regard to, with what they were looking for with the protocol. Here, they were looking at it was some liver function that could have been some at stake here with the data. And so one of the things that we provide, which is really neat, is ask a question about your data. So we're looking at hemoglobin. So let's look for something like anemia where the values might be low. If you understand how your data is, you can pick a coded value, and then you can start to look at the data behind that code. So and for what you're looking for within your data. So for those subjects that had anemia as an adverse event, what were their laboratory values, right? So these instant insights that you can get, from your data visualizations, if it's easy for your users to understand how to use your dashboards, then they can instantly get these. And if you can keep your dashboards simple and consistent, and you might have to do a little training, on things like how the underlying data relates. Like we have adverse events relating to AEs. Technical people understand that. Clinical people may not know that even exists. So we give some functionality, we give some training, train your users. But above all, just keep your dashboard simple. So just one more thing to talk about for your users. We have patient profiles. Again, we mentioned particular subjects, what's happening with that subject in the trial across a number of domains, and we've got a nice set of data here that enables you to see across these domains, whichever domains that they're looking for. These are customizable and very useful, especially when you're trying to track down what's happening with a particular patient during your trial. So keeping things simple, keeping them very standard. Underlying data, having good standard underlying data really helps facilitate good standard dashboards. So if you have good standard data and you have questions from your data, visualizations are really the way to go. Okay, that concludes the demo. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, in conclusion, there are certain principles that you have to follow, but above everything else, you have to know your audience. What do they understand about the data? What do they understand about the study? What do they need to understand? What are those insights that are important to them? And getting them involved in the process of designing your dashboards. We have a lot of standard safety dashboards, but understanding what their needs are and having them help design the dashboards are actually going to make the dashboards more useful for them. So know your audience, and then know your data. You know what they need, you know what they want. Now, will the data support that? So we have good standard data within our industry, the CDISC data, but we're going to be pulling data from real world, right? The real world data. So what can we do in order to facilitate a standardization of that real world data if standards don't currently exist? Also know the veracity of your data, the velocity of your data. You know, the data, the volume, the velocity, the data itself. How can I utilize that data so that it benefits our stakeholders? And then make good data display choices. Keep it simple. Don't use the wrong, don't use a 3D chart when you can use, two-dimensional, because you don't want to confuse things or clutter things. Keep the dashboards at an easy to understand level. Keep it basic as much as you can. And Eric, anything to say about the practices?
Sure, thank you, Chris. So really, just as a reminder to develop and utilize good visualization practices, we've given you a few examples of some good visualizations, and just as importantly showed you a few examples of some data visualizations that could have been done much better. So unfortunately, there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but there are some. If you follow these good practices, you should improve your data visualization capability and make your audience happier and help them to more easily understand your outputs. And as another reminder, please utilize the interactive nature of dashboards. Look for opportunities to simplify these displays, remembering that with dashboards, you can put some filters and drill down capability there, so you really don't have to clutter your display panel because you can jump to other screens to present additional information. And perhaps most importantly, tell compelling stories. We really want to make data the hero and not the villain. And really that's what this all comes down to at the end of the day. We want to thank you for taking the time to listen to us. We really enjoyed it. Please let us know if we can help in any way, and good luck on your data journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric and Chris, for your insights. Now I'd like to move forward with the Q&A portion of the webinar. I'll hand it back to the presenters.
All right, thank you, Avery. It does seem like we have a couple of questions here. I'll just read the first one. How do you handle conflicting requirements or change requests for data displays? Chris, do you want to address that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one, Eric. So you have to understand, like one of the first rules we talked about, understand your audience, right? And what you want to do is when you're going to develop your dashboards, ensure that you have all the stakeholders present, the people that are going to use your dashboards, because if you can get them to agree on what they need early and be consistent, then you won't have changes. But what we do, and what you should probably do, I would recommend following an agile process. So, understand what their needs are, develop a prototype, and then come back to them with the prototype and ensure that they're all in the same meeting, so that somebody that has one viewpoint, that knows what they want, and somebody else from that sponsor wants, they want what they want from the dashboards. Well, you get them together, you look at the prototype, you work out the differences through the iterations of just developing the prototype, because that's fast. Once you get the prototype developed, then you go through the process of the validation later. So to eliminate those change requests through good validation. And as far as the once they start using the dashboards, right? they get experience with the dashboards. They're going to want more. They're going to, you know, they see this and it spurs their imagination. Hey, can we do that? Right. So have a review of your dashboards at the end, and then go ahead and prototype the new ones. If they have a change request, or they want, you know, a new set of dashboards or more dashboards, make sure that, again, you get everybody in the same room and work with them for your dashboards. Okay.
All right, thanks, Chris. And yes, sometimes it comes down to, with regards to change requests, whether the requested change is a nice to have or a have to have, right? Is it strictly necessary? And that can guide your thinking as well. So we do have another question here. How formal does validation or user acceptance testing need to be? Chris,
Okay,
you want to
I
talk
can
about
take
this
that.
one?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. So, you know, really, you have to look at the use cases of the dashboards. If you have operational dashboards, then chances are you don't have to be as strict with your validation, because most of the data is coming out of your database. It's operational data. The decisions, you know, on what to do with these queries or something may not be as critical as decisions on the treatment of the subject or stopping criteria or something where the patient safety is at risk, right? So with a use case like that, then you certainly are going to go through more stringent validation, and it varies the validation that you need for the dashboards. Um, if we have dashboards that are advanced analytical dashboards, then we would certainly want to have a stat review of those dashboards. We also, if we're using an R visualization, because it's a custom, very detailed, very stats heavy presentation, then we're going to want to validate that with a different package or a different language. So we typically, if we develop an R package, an R presentation, we'll go ahead and program that in Python and get the same results. So it's truly independent. We'll have an independent validator with a totally independent system for these very detailed analyses, very critical analyses, so that we have good stringent validation. And within the system that we use, you know, the data that you're clicking around and filtering within the dashboards, and then you see the data presentations move on the screen. If those are R presentations or those are Python presentations, the data gets actually ingested from this Power BI. And so we'll take that data from the filtering and we'll just match the data as well. So we're comparing the data as well as the results. So we can go as in depth as we need depending on the use case.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I would just add also that with regards to validation, just so people get a sense of the scale of validation, potentially with dashboards, with these filters and slicers that you mentioned, you can quickly get to hundreds or even thousands of different, what I'll call sub-dashboards, depending on how you filter the data, right? So it may not, in many cases, be possible to validate every possible view of the data, but we do have systems in place to validate the data going in, and as Chris mentioned, the various levels of the dashboards. So I believe that was our last question, but I'd like to again thank everyone for joining, and I invite you to join us for future webinars.
If you have additional questions on what you heard today, please follow up with your point of contact directly or email media@mmsholdings.com and we'll direct you to a presenter. For additional free webinars, visit mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Thank you for joining us today.